They called her cargo. The manifest called her a mystery box. But when Sheriff Silas Holt pried open that brass-bound trunk in the dust of the rail yard, he didn't find silk or spice. He found a woman in a red kimono who looked at him with eyes that had already survived worse than anything he could threaten her with. And in that moment, the lawman understood that the outlaws who robbed this train weren't the worst criminals on this frontier. Stay until the end to see how this unfolds. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. 3 hours earlier, the sun hung over the Union Pacific line like a hammer that had forgotten how to stop. Silas Holt rode out from Yellowjacket Creek with a warrant in his saddlebag and a bad feeling in his gut. The train had derailed 2 miles east of town, and the outlaws who caused the wreck had already fled with the strongbox, leaving everything else to the dust and the coyotes. When Silas arrived, the rail yard looked like a battlefield played in slow motion. Broken crates spilled grain across the tracks in yellow rivers. A piano lay on its back with its guts exposed, keys still making a faint, dying sound in the hot wind. The railroad agent, a thin man named Polk, waved a manifest and complained about insurance forms while sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. Silas walked the wreckage because that was his job, but also because walking kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. He counted 3 dead horses, 1 dead outlaw, and a dozen shattered barrels of salt pork. The smell of blood and iron hung in the air like a debt that hadn't been paid. Walking occupied his hands until he saw the trunk. It sat apart from the rest, near the rear car that hadn't overturned completely, silk-wrapped and brass-bound, with no maker's mark burned into the wood. It weighed too little for its size, which meant it held something the manifest wouldn't explain. Polk found him staring at it. "Unclaimed cargo goes to the territorial governor for auction," Polk said. "Manifest says mystery box, private shipment, San Francisco to Denver. Private means nobody's responsible, and nobody's responsible means profit for the governor's friends." Silas should have moved on. Dead men waited to be documented, and a posse needed organizing before the trail turned cold. But something about that trunk didn't sit right. Maybe it was the silk, too fine for freight. Perhaps it was the weight, wrong in a way his body knew before his mind could name it. Or maybe the silence inside, denser than the silence around it, as if the wood itself was holding its breath. He told Polk he'd handle the inventory personally. Then he waited until the yard emptied and the only sound was the wind moving through the wreckage like a woman searching for something she'd lost. Yellowjacket Creek had 1 church, 3 saloons, and a sheriff who'd kept the job 10 years by minding his own business. But the trunk was his business now. It came from a federal robbery, and federal robbery made it his. He stood alone in the yard as the sun began to dip toward the ridgeline. The trunk waited while he fetched his crowbar from the saddle. The lock was a puzzle, not the simple iron hasps you saw on strong boxes and grain bins. This was a mechanism of interlocking plates, fine enough to belong on a bank vault. Silas never saw workmanship like it on the frontier. He wedged the crowbar into the gap where the brass met the wood, leaned his weight against it, and felt the metal give with a sound like a sigh. The lid rose. The air that came out smelled of salt, perfume, and fear. Not the sharp fear of a scream, but the old fear of someone afraid so long it had become part of her breath. Inside, no silk, no spice, no gold remained, just a woman. Small, she curled into the corner of the trunk like a fist around something precious. The red kimono had traveled too far. Dust covered the silk, torn at one shoulder, but the color still burned against the dark wood like a coal that wouldn't go out. Ivory combs had slipped loose from hair that fell across a face of sharp angles and eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the trunk. She didn't scream or flinch. She simply looked at him. Silas saw a lot in 10 years of wearing a badge. He'd seen men shot for water, women abandon children at church doors, and entire towns burn because someone struck a match in the wrong mood. He'd never seen this. A human being packed like freight, wearing a garment that cost more than most houses, staring at him with a calm that made his stomach turn. She clutched a lacquered box, small and black, with a cherry blossom painted in gold. White knuckles gripped the box. Silas reached out slowly, the way he'd reached toward a spooked horse. He touched the edge of the trunk. She didn't pull back or lean forward. She simply watched his hand, as if memorizing its shape, in case she needed to know exactly how close death had come before it changed its mind. Polk's voice cut through the silence from 20 yards away. "Property, Sheriff. Unclaimed cargo goes to the territorial governor. You know the statute." Silas didn't look away from her. He couldn't look away. She didn't speak or beg. She simply waited, her eyes holding a question he couldn't understand and a strength he couldn't ignore. He chose before he knew he was choosing, and then he heard himself say it. "This one's mine, Polk. Personal freight. I'll take it into custody." Polk laughed, then stopped when he saw Silas's hand on his revolver. "Personal freight don't wear silk. Mine does," Silas said. And the lie began. Polk didn't believe him, but Silas carried a badge and a gun, and on the frontier, those two things sometimes passed for a court of law. Polk wrote something on his manifest, shook his head, and walked away to count barrels. Silas lifted the woman out of the trunk. She weighed almost nothing, as if the journey had stripped her down to bone and will. She didn't resist. She didn't help. She simply allowed herself to be moved, the way a blade allows itself to be drawn from its sheath. He lifted her onto his horse, wrapped his coat around her shoulders, and rode for his cabin 2 miles south of town. She sat behind him with her hands flat against his back, not holding on, just balancing, the lacquered box pressed against her ribs. He could feel its corners through the fabric of his coat. The cabin was small. 1 room, a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs. He set her by the fire and gave her blankets, water, and jerky. She took the blankets but didn't move, watching the door, the window, and him, while Silas tried English first. "You're safe here." Then Spanish, the few words he knew from the vaqueros. "Estás segura?" Then sounds he'd heard from Chinese workers in Denver. She gave no sign of understanding. She didn't blink or frown. She simply looked at him, eyes that said she had already decided not to trust anyone until they gave her a reason, and he hadn't given her one yet. He turned away to build up the fire. When he looked back, the jerky was gone and the water cup was empty. She had eaten like someone afraid the food would be taken away, fast and silent, her eyes never leaving his hands. Morning came with a knock like a judge's gavel. Marshal Egan stood on the porch, warrant in his fist, 2 deputies behind him, a big man with a beard that hid a weak chin and eyes that counted value before people. "Unclaimed valuable cargo from the robbery," Egan said, holding out the warrant. "Territorial statute. Everything goes to the governor's warehouse for appraisal and sale. That includes mystery boxes." Silas stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. "It's not unclaimed. It's mine." Egan smiled. "A silk trunk full of Japanese property? You always did have expensive taste, Holt." "She's my wife," Silas said. The words fell out of his mouth like stones into a well. "Married 3 weeks ago in Salt Lake. Papers are coming." The lie hung in the air, heavy and strange. Egan studied Silas's face with the patience of a man who earned his living reading liars. Then he looked past Silas at the door. "Your wife," Egan repeated. "I hope she has a name." "Akiko," Silas said, picking the first sound that came to him. It wasn't her name, it was a guess, but it was all he had. Egan turned to his deputies. "We'll be back for proof. Marriage certificate, witness statements. If she's your wife, she'll know your mother's name, your birthday, and how you take your coffee. If she don't, she's cargo, and you're a thief." The marshal rode out. Silas stood on the porch and watched the dust settle. Inside, the woman he had named Akiko sat with perfect posture, one hand hidden beneath the folds of the coat he'd given her, the other resting flat on the table. She didn't blink. She studied him the same way he'd been learning her, and the lesson was just beginning. Days passed in a language of gestures and silences. Silas pointed at himself and said, "Silas." He pointed at her. She said nothing. He pointed at the fire, the water, the horse. She watched him with the patience of someone who had spent weeks in a trunk and knew that time moved differently for people who had nowhere to go. He learned 3 things quickly. She slept with the lacquered box under her pillow. She woke before dawn and sat perfectly still, watching the door as if the wood might betray her. She also understood the human body in ways no one in Yellowjacket Creek ever learned. The cut happened on the third day. Silas chopped firewood behind the cabin, distracted by a sound on the ridge that turned out to be a stray cow. The axe slipped. The blade opened a gash across his palm that filled his hand with blood before he felt the pain. He cursed and wrapped it with a rag. When he came inside, she already stood, not asking permission. She took his hand, peeled back the rag, and looked at the wound with the focus of a judge reading a death sentence. Then she reached for the lacquered box. Inside, beneath black silk, lay needles so fine they caught no light, looking like hair made of silver. Beside them were small packets of herbs wrapped in rice paper, each marked with a character Silas couldn't read. She chose one packet, tore it open with her teeth, and mixed the contents with water from the bucket. The smell hit him like pine and salt and something older, something that belonged in a temple rather than a frontier cabin. She cleaned the wound with the mixture. The pain vanished immediately, as if she turned off a switch he didn't know he owned. Then she chose a needle, held it up to the light from the window, and pressed it into the skin near the gash. He felt a strange warmth spread through his hand, followed by a numbness that made the cut feel like it belonged to someone else. Silas never saw anything like it. He watched her hands. They were steady in a way that spoke of years of training, of a discipline that didn't come from books alone. He tried to ask where she learned this. She didn't understand, but touched the box and said one word, "Okasan." It means mother. That was the first bridge, the first word that crossed the distance between them. He said it back, "Okasan." It sounded like a stone dropped in mud. She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth moved, and that was enough. Word spread in Yellowjacket Creek the way bad news always does, fast and twisted. The sheriff had a Japanese wife who didn't talk and carried needles. Men joked about it in the saloon. Women crossed the street when Silas rode into town for supplies, and some men remembered the trunk. Some recalled the bandits who had robbed that train. Some men knew who had paid for the shipment. A foreman named Kroll said he'd heard the Japanese use needles to curse a man from the inside. A gambler named Reese said he'd seen her in Denver before the wreck, walking behind a man in a Denver suit with a ledger. A drunk at the bar said the railroad had lost 3 similar shipments in the last year, all bound for private addresses, marked as medical supplies. Nobody believed the drunk, but Silas did, and Silas heard the whispers. He saw the strangers who rode past the cabin without stopping, their eyes on the chimney smoke. He knew what came next. The territory didn't let go of its property without a fight. Midnight comes with no moon. The ridge behind the cabin is a black line against a blacker sky. Silas is asleep in his chair, his shoulder holstered revolver within reach, when the horses stop at the tree line. 3 men dismount. They don't wear masks because they don't need to. They're the railroad's security, which means they do the dirty work the law can't touch. The wind carries the smell of horse sweat and gun oil. Silas knows that smell. It means men who decided to kill someone before they arrived and are waiting to see who it will be. The leader is a man named Voss. Silas has seen him before, hanging around the depot in Cheyenne, watching cargo with the eyes of a man who knows the price of everything. Voss steps onto the porch and knocks once, politely, the way a creditor knocks before he takes the farm. "Sheriff Holt," Voss says, "we know she's in there. We know the trunk belonged to us, and we know you don't have the paperwork to keep what don't belong to you." Silas stands up. His hand finds the revolver. "It's my cabin, my wife, and my paperwork is none of your concern." Voss laughs. It's a dry sound, like leather cracking. "Hand her over. You don't want a war with the company. The company built the tracks you're standing on and the law you're hiding behind. The marshal, the judge, the governor, they all eat out of our hand. You're one man with a 6-shooter and a badge that means less than the tin it's made from." The door opens behind Silas. Akiko steps out. She's not wearing the kimono now. She's in trail clothes, her hair pulled back tight, her face all sharp angles and dark eyes. She holds a blade, not a kitchen knife, but a tanto, short and honest, the kind a woman keeps when she knows the world takes what it wants. She doesn't raise it, but lets them see it, while one of Voss's men reaches for his gun. Akiko's eyes move to him, and her look isn't a glance, but a fixation. The man stops. His hand hovers near the grip, but he doesn't draw, because something in her stillness tells him that drawing would be a mistake he wouldn't survive. Voss looks at her, then at the blade, then at her eyes. They're the same calm Silas saw in the trunk, the calm of someone who has already accepted the worst possible outcome and has decided to meet it on her feet. Voss hesitates, and that's all Silas needs. Silas doesn't think, he just acts. The revolver clears leather and the shot tears through the valley. Voss falls. The second man fires wild as he runs, and the third doesn't fire at all. He just grabs the reins and kicks his horse into the dark. The echo bounces off the ridge and rolls down toward the creek, where it dies among the cottonwoods. For a moment, there's no sound but the breathing of horses and the soft, wet sound of Voss bleeding into the porch boards. But one of them fired a shot before he ran. The bullet takes Silas in the shoulder, but he doesn't fall or even stagger. He just watches them ride away into the dark, leaving their leader in the dirt. Akiko is at his side before he can turn. Her hands press against the wound. Her face is unreadable in the firelight from the open door. She says a word in his ear. Daijobu. It means it's okay. It's not okay, but she's trying. Silas looks down at his shoulder. Blood spreads across his shirt in a dark flower. The pain hasn't arrived yet. It will come. But right now, there are only her hands, warm and steady, and the word she has given him, which means nothing and everything at once. He sits down heavily on the step. Akiko kneels beside him. She tears his shirt open with the tanto, exposing the wound. Her hands work with the same precision she used on his cut 3 days before, but this time with different tools. A needle to numb the flesh, a poultice to slow the bleeding, and a strip of cloth from her own sleeve to bind it tight. She doesn't ask if he's all right. She knows he's not. She simply does what needs to be done, the same way she survived the trunk, the same way she will survive whatever comes next. When she's finished, she sits back on her heels and looks at him. For the first time, she doesn't look like a survivor. She looks like a woman who has decided that this man, this cabin, this fragile arrangement of silence and need is worth defending. Not out of love or trust, but because she has measured him and found him to be the only thing in this territory that hasn't tried to break her. Silas can't ride to the doctor. The doctor is 3 hours away, and the company men are watching the roads. Akiko treats the wound herself. She uses the needles. She uses poultices that draw the fever out and hold it in the room like a visible heat. For 3 days, Silas drifts in and out of consciousness, caught in dreams where he opens the trunk again and again, and each time finds something different inside. A child, a corpse, a mirror showing his own face. When the fever breaks, he finds her asleep in the chair beside his bed. The lacquered box sits open on her lap, the needles glinting in the morning light. He touches the box gently, the way he'd touch a sleeping bird. She wakes, her eyes finding his, and doesn't startle but simply waits. He points at the needles. What is this? She thinks, then says, Hari. It means needles. He points at the herbs. Kusuri. It means medicine. She points at him and says, Silas. Then she points at herself and says, Akiko. Her name is Akiko. It means something, but he doesn't know what yet. He says it back. It feels strange in his mouth, like a word from a prayer he hasn't earned the right to speak. She touches his lips with one finger, correcting the shape of the sound. Her fingertip is warm and calloused from work he can't name. He says it again, and this time she nods. The nod is small, but it lands in his chest like a stone falling into deep water. That night, by lamplight, they built a vocabulary, not with grammar or books, but with objects. She teaches him words for fire and water, horse and danger, good and bad. She writes the characters in ash on the table, and he sounds them out until she nods or shakes her head. It's slow, frustrating, and the most honest conversation he's had in 10 years. He learns that her father doctored in Kyoto, that traffickers told her she was going to America to marry a merchant who owned a tea shop in San Francisco, that the merchant didn't exist and the trunk was real, and those who put her in it spoke a language she didn't understand but recognized by the tone of business, commerce, and a deal being closed. She describes the ship, the weeks below deck, the trunk delivered to her room like a gift, except the gift was the lock on the outside. She describes the man in the Denver suit who checked on her once a day, opened the lid to make sure she still breathed, and closed it again without speaking. She speaks of the sound of the train, the crash, and the silence that followed, when she lay in the dark and waited for someone to come, not for rescue, but for inventory. He learns that she doesn't cry, not from inability, but because she decided long ago that tears are a luxury she couldn't afford. Tears mean you're hoping someone will see them, and hope, in her experience, is the most expensive thing a person can carry. Silas doesn't know what to say to that, so he doesn't say anything. He simply puts his hand on the table, palm up, the way he would offer a horse an apple. She looks at it for a long moment. Then she puts her hand in his. It isn't a grip or a clasp, just two hands resting together in the lamplight, sharing warmth in a country that has been cold to both of them. Marshal Egan returns on the 5th day, not alone. He brings a railroad lawyer from Denver, a thin man with a gold watch chain and a briefcase full of papers that say what the law is. He brings a man in a black suit who represents the import company that shipped the trunk. And he brings 2 warrants. One for Akiko's arrest as unregistered foreign property. One for Silas's removal from office for obstruction and false declaration. The warrants are written on heavy paper with a seal that looks official but smells like money. Egan waves them like flags, proud of the power they represent. Silas is still weak from the wound. The ride to the cabin has cost him more than he wants to admit. He stands in the doorway with his revolver visible but not drawn, listening while the lawyer talks about property law, the Denver man talks about restitution, and Egan talks about the governor's generous policy of sharing proceeds from unclaimed cargo with local law enforcement. Akiko stands behind Silas, holding the lacquered box in both hands. She doesn't speak because she doesn't need to. She simply opens the box. Inside, beneath the needles and the herbs, lies a folded paper, a bill of sale with names, dates, routes, ships, and prices. It's not just evidence of her trafficking. It's evidence of a network that runs from the docks of San Francisco to the brothels of the Dakotas. A network that pays marshals, governors, and men in black suits to ride out to frontier cabins and collect what they bought. Egan's face changes. The color drains from it like water from a broken canteen. The Denver man's face changes too, but in a different way. His eyes narrow. He reaches for the paper. Silas's revolver clears leather in a motion that feels like it started before his mind gave the order. "Don't," he says, and the Denver man stops, smiling. "You don't know what you're holding, Sheriff. That's bigger than you. It's bigger than this territory. That's men in Washington who sign the laws that make the railroad possible. You want to die for a piece of paper?" Silas thinks about the 10 years he's worn the badge. He thinks about the outlaws he's chased, the drunks he's jailed, the settlers he's buried. He thinks about the law, which he always believed was a wall between civilization and chaos. Now he sees it for what it is, a ledger, a balance sheet, a way of keeping score while the real crimes happen in plain sight. He looks at the paper, then at Akiko. She has not moved or flinched. She says one word in English, the only English word he has taught her that matters. Truth. He understands. She didn't just survive the trunk. She survived it because she knew something they didn't. She knew that those who traffic in people also traffic in records. And she stole the record. She hid it under her mother's needles. She kept it through the ship, the train, the wreck, and the silence. She kept it because she knew a piece of paper could be heavier than a gun, if the right person read it. The word sits between them like a challenge. The lawyer doesn't know what to do with it. The Denver man knows exactly what to do with it, and he doesn't like it. Egan looks at Silas, then at the gun, then at the woman who has turned a cabin in the middle of nowhere into a courtroom where the only judge is the truth. Silas makes a choice. He doesn't arrest Egan or shoot the Denver man. He takes the warrants from Egan's hand, walks to the stove, and drops them into the fire. The paper curls and blackens. The seal melts. The law burns with a smell like old leather and dying authority. The flames cast shadows that dance on the cabin walls, making the room look like a place where old gods come to watch empires end. "Ride back to the governor," Silas says, His voice is steady, but his shoulder is bleeding again, a dark stain spreading through the bandage. Tell him the cargo is gone, the proof is gone, and the sheriff of Yellowjacket Creek is gone too, because the law he swore to uphold just tried to sell a human being, and he won't wear a badge that means nothing. Egan stares at the burning paper. You're finished, Holt. You're a dead man. The company will send 10 men, maybe 20. They'll burn this cabin and salt the ground. Let them come, Silas says, but if you ever set foot in my county again, Marshal, I'll treat you like the outlaw you are, and I don't negotiate with outlaws. Egan's jaw tightens. He turns, walks to his horse, and mounts. The lawyer follows, fumbling with his briefcase. The Denver man is the last to leave. He studies Akiko with a look that isn't anger, it's recognition. He knows what she has cost him, and what she will cost him still. Then he tips his hat, a gesture so polite it feels like a threat, and rides away. Silas and Akiko ride out that night, not away from the territory but deeper into it. Toward the next county, the next town, the next place where the law is just a word men use to take what they want. She rides beside him, not behind him. Her horse is his spare, a roan mare with a gentle gait. She holds the reins like she was born to them. Her back is straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She doesn't look back at the cabin or the smoke from the stove where the warrants turn to ash. She looks forward, because forward is the only direction the trunk didn't have. He doesn't know if his choice was right, he only knows it was necessary. He doesn't know if they'll survive the winter, the company, or the long road ahead. He knows the woman riding next to him has survived worse than all of it, and she's still here. That has to be enough. The moon rises over the ridge, cold and indifferent, lighting a trail that leads east into country neither of them has seen. They don't speak. There's nothing to say that the silence doesn't already cover. The lacquered box is tied to her saddle, safe and secret, its contents more dangerous than any weapon. Somewhere behind them, whispers will travel faster than horses. They'll reach Denver and Washington, and somewhere, in an office lined with maps and ledgers, a man will open a drawer and realize that one lost shipment has become the most expensive loss his company has ever suffered. He glances at her profile in the moonlight, the sharp cheekbones, the narrow jaw, the eyes that have seen the worst the world can offer and have decided to keep looking anyway. He remembers the word she taught him, truth. He remembers the word he taught her, friend. He thinks about all the words they haven't learned yet, and all the miles they'll need to learn them in. 2 weeks later, in a town called Dry Fork, Silas sat in a room above a livery stable and wrote a letter to the federal marshal in St. Louis. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He sent copies of the evidence Akiko had hidden, and a list of names, and a statement written in his own hand that said exactly what had happened and exactly who had been paid to look away. He knew it might not be enough. The network was deep, the money was old, and the federal marshal was a political appointment who answered to the same men who signed the railroad's contracts. But Silas sent it anyway. For the first time since he opened the trunk, he felt like a lawman again. Not because he wore a badge, but because he was standing between a wrong and the people who wanted it to stay hidden. The feeling didn't come from power. It came from the absence of fear. For 10 years, he enforced laws he didn't write in a territory that didn't want them against men who could buy the judges who interpreted them. Now he had nothing. No badge, no authority, no allies. And yet, he had never felt more certain of what he was supposed to do. Akiko sat across the table, the lacquered box open between them. She pointed first at Silas, then at the box, then at her own heart. Tomodachi, she said. It means friend. He said it back. Tomodachi. It sounded wrong, the syllables thick and foreign in his mouth. She smiled. It isn't a big smile, not the smile of someone who has forgotten what happened to her, but the kind that starts at the corners of the mouth and works its way inward, slowly, like thaw. She reached across the table and touched his hand, the same hand that had held the revolver and burned the warrants. Her fingers rested on his knuckles for a moment, light and certain, and then she returned to her needles, packing them in order, preparing for a journey that had no map. Outside, the territory stretched on, indifferent and vast, while the network was still out there, and so were those who wanted the evidence back. And somewhere ahead, there would be another town, another lawman, another choice between paper and blood. But that was a story for another day. Silas Holt opened a trunk and found a woman. He didn't find justice. He found a reason to keep fighting. If you want to see where this road leads, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.